Hello, welcome to Enjoy the Book of Life. I'm here with my friend Todd, and we met recently, but each time we've met up and had something to talk about, we found a lot of like interests. So really excited about this, and we've got a resource review, a book with quite an interesting title. It really piqued my interest. It's called Love Thy Body, and it has a lot of big topics here. There it
Brought it
is.
with me. There it is. In case you wanted to see the front cover.
So, what is, with a title like that, I've got to ask, so what's the premise of this book?
Yeah, so this is a book by Nancy Piercy. So she's a apologetic professor at Houston Baptist University, and she's actually if you kind of look into her story, she got saved through the teaching of Francis Schaeffer over in Switzerland. If people know his background and the La Brie that he started in the I think 70s. And so she has a really neat premise because it's a lot like his thinking. If you know a little bit or a lot of bit about how he approaches the Christian worldview, as he's very focused on, what she drives at is that we need to love our body and appreciate how God made us
Mm,
and how God cares about how he made our body besides our spirit and our soul.
mm,
And the premise that she kind of hinges on, that it's at the beginning, I'd say the intro in the first chapter, is a lot of thinking like Francis Schaeffer, where he explains this mind versus body, or this fact versus value split. He actually explains it like an upper story and a lower story. And she hints at that a little bit, but she actually draws a dividing line. It almost looks like a numerator denominator.
yeah.
But she says that up in the upper tier is mind or spirituality or things that are a little bit might we say difficult to prove and intangible.
Yeah.
Morals you'd put up there. I'm sure you think of a few others, David, that you've read about. And then below she would put body, or the physical components of this life. And her point behind all this, and like I said, Francis Schaeffer, but her point about all this is that the way God made us is there's a seamless integration of the two, that
Hmm.
they're in harmony, that there is amazing, beautiful things to appreciate about each of those separately, but also appreciate how they work together. And we see it in our bodies, our body and mind, soul, spirit, our morals, like some of the things I already mentioned, they go hand in hand. And she goes through that in the book. However, her point is the world today, maybe even the past 100 years, has slowly gotten this way. They love to separate that and
Yeah.
push that further and further, where the body is this, I hate to say, out of body experience, this distant thing that I can treat however I want and do with it whatever I want. And there's no repercussions. There's no responsibility. I can just do with it as I may. And
Yeah, there's
she
no
goes that a lot.
transfer. No
Yeah.
transfer. It's
Yeah.
a non-permeable membrane that
Hmm.
whatever happens over here doesn't affect what happens over there, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's kind of interesting is that she kind of hints at and shows through the chapters. We could talk about that a little bit, how she breaks down some of the subjects she covers, is that the thinking today almost gives the mind carte blanche and
Hmm.
says you can, and is basically saying that you can let the mind be whatever you think, whatever you think is right. In the book of Judges, you find whatever thing you want to do with your hands, whatever you want to do with your life, that is like you're your own god, is what she's getting at. And that's the thinking, because you have no, like I said, repercussions or things to be responsible for when you separate it out like that. So that's the premise. And what she wants to go then through the book, and she does, and she hits some. I can talk about the main portions, but she hits, I'd say, six or seven, well, about six um, main topics of today, and how you see that come into play and how it plays out, like the implications. So she hits abortion, euthanasia, the hookup culture, homosexuality, the trans LGBT, thought process. And then I kind of put this one, I know it's different than the others, but she talks about social contract at the end. And we can talk about that for a little bit, but contract versus biological obligation.
Yeah.
And so, and I would say, actually, to maybe a little caveat is that, sometimes when you start a book like this, people sometimes throw a theory out there, and it's like, okay, are you forcing everything into this theory? But I think what she does in this book is she actually shows very explicitly that she's not just forcing it, it's very clear. And she'll actually say, if it weren't this way, then you'd see X, Y, and Z, but we don't see those. So, and she proves her point in saying that, like, I'm just seeing what I'm seeing. And she also shows biblically that, she uses a lot of verses through the scriptures to show how God cares about the body besides the spirit and the soul.
Yeah, yeah. And so you mentioned those major topics that she really addresses through the book. And it is amazing because you think, so they're all have to do with the body, but she ties them all back. They all root back to that premise of the book, because each time,
Hmm.
and that first little bit is a bit heavy, going
Hmm.
through with the split, the fact value split.
It is.
And as she's talking through that, I was a little like, uh-oh, it's going to be like this the whole way. But
Uh-huh.
once you get past that, it's important to get that part down, because
It is.
each chapter is rooted off that, and it is amazing. You see
Hmm.
all these different things, and you wouldn't, when you're thinking about, yeah, you've got the trans community and homosexuality and
Hmm.
abortion, euthanasia,
Hmm.
to see how it all comes from this little twist on the worldview, and
Hmm.
how these are the logical outcomes, and then how it contrasts with the scriptures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say as well, to further emphasize your point, is that, yeah, when I was going into this book, I not hes I don't think hesitance is the right word, but I was thinking, oh, this could be very philosophical. This
Hmm.
could be very scholarly. But she, as I believe you read it, uses a lot of scripture. A lot of times where I'm like, oh, okay, oh, that's great, good, great verse there. I was pleasantly surprised how well she weaved in
Yep.
scriptures.
Yep.
Besides using, and we can get to it in a little bit perhaps, but like she uses great examples from both sides of the argument. She uses real life examples, not just hypothetical examples. She uses, quotes from both sides of the argument. So she's really eclectic in that sense, but the book is peppered with lots of Bible verses as well to show God's care, and I think she weaves it in quite well to show the theme throughout the scriptures.
Yeah, one specific example that I really appreciated was she was talking about, she gave some parallelisms uh, in the Psalms, where David would say, my body,
Hmm.
whatever, and then he'd say, my soul, whatever. And it
Yeah.
showed that these two were a parallel, that his body, his soul. And so really good use of the scripture.
Yeah.
I agree. And one of the things I most appreciated was a lot of this idea of creation, viewing God as the creator. We are his creation. This the way he formed us,
Hmm.
his relationship to us as a creator, and portions like Romans 1 that talks about how they didn't take the evidence of the creation, and instead they went their own way,
Hmm.
right? And I don't think that really clicked with me. I
Hmm.
used to think it was like, okay, you go out on a nature walk, right? This idea of creation, and I think it is clearly seen. But I think when I was reading through this this book specifically,
Hmm.
it really showed, to me anyway, here the way God has created us, and he's made us as multifaceted, but he's
Hmm.
created us with certain purposes,
Yep.
and in a certain fashion, in a certain manner, and he teaches about it in his word, and nature testifies of it. And when we
Yep.
start to take things out of whack, that bad things
Yeah.
start happening when we don't read the owner's
Yeah.
manual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a pleasantly surprised moment. I'll say actually for mine, perhaps, well, and this goes, I think, hand in hand with what you're saying, is that um, when she was kind of teeing up this whole intro in first chapter such, I was thinking, okay, she's gonna go into, my body as a temple, for the
Yeah.
Lord Jesus. And some of those verses about my body. And of
Yeah.
course she does. She does, and which is great.
Yeah.
However, she brought about that the Lord Jesus's body
Hmm.
was prepared for him. And she brings about verses like, Colossians 2:9, John 1:14, he tabernacled among us. Hebrews 10:10, 1 John 4:2, it says Jesus has come in the flesh. Like she gives examples of verses where he doesn't have to call out body. He could say something a little bit different, but it's emphasized flesh or body. And it's like, oh shoot, I mean, like I got that, but like the way and kind of like what you said about David, the way she kind of juxtaposed them together, you're like, oh, that's really something and that's why I wanted to kind of bring this book about. It really helped me see the scriptures in a better light because she highlighted things that I missed, and it helps put in context with some of these arguments of today that we're seeing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Yeah,
both of those. So what would you say are you gave that one there, but what were some of your
sure.
other favorite portions or things about this book? What are some of those areas going through it? It was quite a hefty book. There are a lot of good portions, but would you say are some of your favorite portions or things about this book?
That's a good question. I do feel like a lot of arguments today, well, I don't know if argument's the right word. A lot of times where we see Christians draw lines and push back is with abortion and either, maybe homosexuality, the trans culture, those ones. I appreciated how, as an example, she actually had a whole chapter on the hookup culture
Hmm.
and this view of sex as so, like, meaningless and distant, and I can do whatever I want with it, with my, sexual lifestyle, whatever, and just that in general. Because I think that sometimes Christians don't. I think we're just kind of like, oh, I mean, this is the way the world is. That's the way colleges are. That's the way life is. Whatever. But she really highlights that quite well. Actually, at one point, I forget if she was quoting someone or maybe she just made her own point, but she was saying that sometimes with the way Christians kind of um, avoid talking about the heterosexual liberties that people can have with their sexual lifestyle, but argue so hard about the homosexual lifestyle. It's so incongruous that it's like you're hypocritical. Like you should call out both. And I think somebody even said it's just a matter of who you're in a relationship with. Other than that, they're the same thing because they're both living outside of the marriage setup that the Lord has made for us. But
Yeah.
you're condemning one, but you're condemning one, but you're kind of like letting the other go. And it's like, no, so I appreciated that. And then also euthanasia. I don't know if we hear that as much as some of these other one, and the value of a life on
Yeah.
that side. We talk about value of life with abortion and with the womb, but the value at the end of life. You
Yeah.
know, we talk about. I actually wasn't planning on bringing this up, but I have a very close friend who had his wife was pregnant with a baby son, and they knew in the gestational period that he would have no kidneys and likely die right away after birth.
Mm.
And they were pressured to have an abortion. I know I'm talking about abortion in a sense, but I'll get to why euthanasia and preserving a life. But they were pressured that way. But the value of a life of what he and his wife appreciated was having closure, having be able they were able to hold their child for 30 minutes before the child passed away,
Mm.
and the kids, his kids got to hold the baby infant
Mm.
for 30 minutes and have that closure. And so one of her points about euthanasia is, you want to cut off a life the second you think it's no longer a person or a life. Um, but what if you can have closure, have a relationship with that grandfather, grandmother, a few more months, a few more hours, a few more weeks? That time is so precious, and
Hmm.
you're just you're tossing it away. So it's, my example of my friend, as well as in this argument, it's like, yeah, I mean, what if what if you had a couple more weeks and you had amazing stories you heard from them, you were able to encourage them in certain ways and just love and appreciate being there with them, and you're just tossing that out the window. So I was really encouraged by that and convicted at the same point too, that I need to emphasize that more in my mind and more when I'm talking with people.
Yeah, yeah. And this is something I think, I hope for those who read this, it will be a jumping off point, right? That it's not, hey, read this book so you can win all the arguments,
Correct.
right? That
No.
when I view something, I want it to be biblical. And so
Yeah.
I think really this is the premise, that she wants a biblical view of what God has for us with our body. And so I think she does a
Yeah.
great job anticipating arguments, like
Hmm.
you said,
Hmm.
giving good quotes on both sides of the issue, and addressing side issues. So we
Hmm.
talked about here the big topics, but then,
Yep.
for example, in the chapter on abortion, she
Hmm.
talks about how men typically are silenced from this
Hmm.
issue, right? You're
Hmm.
not, you'll never get pregnant. You don't get to have an opinion on this, right? And she says, well, no, it's the man's duty to protect those who can't protect themselves, and these babies, they can't protect themselves. And so, sorry, guys, you're not let off the hook, right?
Oh.
To not have a stance, to not care, right? I don't want to
Hmm.
say not care, but not be active, right?
Yeah.
In whatever capacity that takes.
Hmm.
So a lot of these little side issues that tend to spring up, she does a good job at addressing those as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, actually, I'll give a quick. I wanted to give two more little points about what I appreciated about how she approached the book. But
Yeah.
to your point, just the other day I was flipping through and I remembered a part she mentioned about giving freedoms to same-sex couples to marry. You know,
Hmm.
people say, well, that's not, you're hindering their rights, you're hindering their liberties to be able to do that. Okay, that's one way to approach it. But her point is, it's not that per se. It's that once you say same-sex couples can marry, just like heterosexual couples can marry, excuse me, you're devaluing and you're deconstructing the biological obligation that a man has to a woman and a man and a wife have to their children.
Mm.
Because suddenly same-sex couples, and she brings up the point about like what if they want to have what if they want to adopt? Well, one of them at most can be on a birth certificate. So then the question becomes, well, who do you put as the other name for the parent on the birth certificate? It becomes not a biological thought process of, oh, husband or father and mother. That's clear as day.
Yeah.
It's, well, whoever they define or whoever the government defines or the hospital defines. And suddenly you kind of snowball it and it's like, okay, well then, and she kind of goes to other implications and it's like, yeah, we're just trying to uphold the biological obligation that a father and mother have to the children and a husband and wife have to each other. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, that's a great point.
Yeah, and there, when you're talking about the definition, back to euthanasia and declaring someone dead. When is someone dead? When do we
Yeah.
pull the plug? And she says, up, like at this point, it's up to whatever doctor's there to do the definition. And again, it comes back to this playing God, and being able to declare what is and what isn't, instead of
Yeah.
going back to what it is God says.
I don't know if you caught it, but she even used I didn't remember this, but I think it was the year 2000. John Kerry was on the presidential campaigning, and
Yeah,
he said that as a Democrat, he said I believe life begins at conception.
yeah,
And she said, people were like, what? And he said, but yeah, we just need to define what a person is.
right,
So
right.
it's interesting, and that's why I think she's very eclectic on all sides of the coin of saying, look who's saying what. I'm not just one sided, and I appreciate that a lot. I think the 2 points I want to get is, one, she doesn't just bring up arguments and thought processes to be like, here's your ammo. I mean,
Yes,
that's one
right.
thing. It comes with the territory, but that's not her point. She wants to hit all as many as she can, all the side points and main points, and so she gives a very broad approach as best she can. But she also, and I think you and I talked about this, I also was very much appreciative of her approach at the end of each chapter of saying, here are ways as Christians you
Yes.
can lovingly respond and lovingly act how you should. So, like, as an example, she was like, look at all of the pregnancy centers in the United States that are supporting women that are maybe single mothers or maybe are, pushed to have an abortion because financial reason, whatever, and they're there to try to help them other ways outside of abortion. You could support them in this way, and here's a list of them. And she gives resources, and she
Yeah.
also gives ways to be forgiving, to be patient, to understand exactly where the Bible draws the line and doesn't. And so she doesn't, like, I think you say this a lot about a lot of things. I say this at work, like, you don't want to just complain
Yeah.
and then have no solution.
Yeah.
Like, you want to, yeah, highlight the problem points, like, because you have to define the problem to have a
Hmm.
solution, but then you have to give solutions as well. And as a Christian, we should give loving, patient, kind, but standing on truth decisions and responses.
Yeah. Yeah. They're
Yeah.
going back to the loving your neighbor as yourself. Yeah.
Hmm.
Good.
Yeah.
Um, Now, so this is a pretty hefty book,
Hmm.
and it is something that hits a lot of, like we said, really current issues, things that are
Hmm.
very much under attack. I really
Hmm.
like how she peels back the curtain a little bit,
Hmm. Yep.
show those underlying thoughts. I was the same with you. When I first started the book, I was like, this is going to be all philosophy and everything. Really
Yeah.
appreciated the scripture through it. Who would you recommend this book to most?
I would say, I would say most any Christian, maybe that's 12 and up. In the
Yeah.
sense, the
Yep.
reason I say that, the reason I'm hesitant, the reason I say that is because, and let me clarify, is that there are some pretty explicit stories and
Yep.
examples that she gives, and because she wants to be honest and she wants to, like I said, give both sides of the argument and give real life scenarios that have occurred. Because she doesn't want to, mince words and lie or twist. Here's what happened. How does God assess us? How should we assess us? So I would be hesitant to have someone younger read this. And I think it's up to obviously parents or whoever to have discerning eyes and thoughts about that. But I would say, because of where we're at in 2023,
Hmm.
I think any Christian should read this. And I've actually encouraged many people as I've talked about this. This is usually the frontline book that I say you really should check out because it's excellent.
Yeah. You Now originally I asked you for a list of books, or I asked you what you wanted, and you gave me a list of books, and then you said, "Well, actually, I really want to do this book." So I'm like, "Okay, great." And I hadn't really looked at it or anything, and then I
Hmm.
saw it, and I saw the topic, read a little bit about it. I'm like, "Oof, this is some topic,"
Yeah.
but it's so needed,
Mhm.
and being able to sit and talk about these issues.
Yeah.
And I think it would be good for people to do that, more people to read it and read it in
Hmm.
groups and to talk about.
Yeah.
Um, Now,
Yeah. I would agree.
yeah, I've already recommended it
Oh,
a few
good.
times, yeah, since
That's awesome.
then, obviously recommending it here.
Yeah.
But what suggestions would you have on how to get the most out of this book?
Mm. I well, I'll just give you the way I read it, and I think helped me a lot was I don't do this a lot, but with books, I usually shy away from obviously highlighting or underlining because I feel like it clusters the book a little bit and gets it a little too busy. But this one, I actually was like, no, because it's going to have a lot in it that I'm probably going to want to go back to. So I would star it or underline or say good quote or something to go back to know really to where draw my attention to, when flipping back through. But I did that a lot because it's a really really great book. I think just taking your time
Hmm.
and going through it. And what she does is the chapters aren't overly long. They might be like 30 or so pages, but
Yep.
she has very distinct sections where you could
Yep.
read a little section that's maybe a page long, another one's two-thirds of a page long. So she breaks it down very well. And the thought process, it's not just like, hey, let me give you something to read for 2 minutes at night. It's also each, you know, three paragraphs, subsections are well thought out in how she organized it as well. So I would just say take your time, be
Yep.
more than willing to. She doesn't talk like she's a double PhD professor that's trying
Right.
to overwhelm you with words. She doesn't. It's also very down to earth. Like I said,
Yep.
real life. Sometimes blunt in your face, real life. But at the same time, it is kind of deep the way she's making you think. So this is what I actually wanted to circle back to. This is that Francis Schaeffer said this a lot too. He said, you know, have something taken to its logical conclusion. Because if you do that, if it's not true truth, he loved to say that, if it's not true truth, it won't jive with reality. You're
Hmm.
gonna find some cracks in the armor, some kinks in the armor that are obvious because true truth. The 2 + 2 is 4. You're gonna be able to do any math equation, and 2 + 2 is always gonna equal 4.
Yep.
And the same thing with the Lord and how He's infused truth throughout life. If it's really truth, take it to its logical, and that's what she does a lot. She says it doesn't line up with reality if you take this, whatever example, and fit it here, and
Yep.
here's where the Bible clarifies what's missing. So I think as you take your time to say, okay, she's not talking over my head, but I do need to really, it is a
Yep.
thinking book.
Yep.
But I think it'll bless you in the end. Yeah, for sure.
Yep. Chesterton described it as a key, truth as a key. And he said it should fit the locks, right?
Hmm.
Each place you put it, it should fit. And so that's a good way to test the truth, is to start fitting it in the different locks around you.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the things with this, I think, like I said before, having a little group go through it and talk through the book as you do it, I
Sure.
find that helpful. I think
Well, don't
yeah, go
forget, at the
ahead.
very end of the book, I don't know if you noticed that, but at the very end of the book there are like study review questions by chapter.
Yep.
So you could also go through them with that group as well. That I think could be a good talking points if that would be helpful.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I agree with those little chunks. It really does help. I think if those were not there, it would be a lot harder of a trip, through the
Yeah,
chapters. But very
yeah.
well organized. Um, One of the things I would say, because as I was reading it, it was stimulating, not
Mm-hmm.
just with current issues,
Mm-hmm.
but also with, again, scripturally, this
Mm-hmm.
idea of the body
Totally.
and what else does the Bible say about my body, and how does this fit and how does this work? Well,
Mm-hmm.
how does this work with this verse and this passage, right? And so I would even prompt people, again, don't view this as some sort of ammunition. I think that's
Yeah,
I never got that tone
very much so. Mm-mm.
reading through her book, which is
Mm-mm.
another thing I really appreciated. But to go at it as here's a starting point, right?
Yeah,
Here's a good um, resource that sets you off in the right direction, that'll allow you to really tackle a lot of these issues, because you can tell she's well read, like you said, a lot of good quotes,
yeah.
a lot of good sources,
Mm-hmm.
and a really handy resource, like you said. Yeah.
Yeah, if the listener would have interest to hear maybe directly from her before they read it as well. I know she's actually talked about this book on a few podcasts and her thought process behind it, giving so you could search Nancy Piercy "Love Thy Body" in the podcast platform that you have. I've done that a little
Yeah.
bit. One quote I actually got from her that I wanted to share is that she emphasizes that the truth of God and the truth of His Word is not just true truth in that it's actually true in and of itself, but it's also good truth.
Mm,
And she says that the Christians must present biblical morality in a way that reveals the beauty of the biblical view of the human person so that people actually want it to be true. And I
yeah.
really like that because sometimes we're afraid, like, oh, should I say this? Should I say that? But if we really emphasize it, and if we're really used to the Lord to emphasize it clearly the way He has for us in the scriptures, it should hit something in the eternity in their hearts to say, this is what I'm missing. It is
Yeah.
beautiful. It is awesome. It is amazing to see, the amazingness of creation around us. It should lead people to be speechless and want to turn to the Lord. So we shouldn't be hesitant of that and appreciate the true truth component, but also that it's good.
Yeah. Yeah. One example of that she presents it with that same tone in her book. is when she's talking about how a lot of times people will use Christianity and kind of say, well, you're trying to hold women back, right? You want to put us back before the women's rights movement and everything like that. And she
Yeah.
goes back to the New Testament era and why the lifting up of women via Christianity made it so attractive. And again, it was like people wanted it to be true because it raised up the view of women, the view of children, right? That children weren't non-persons, right?
Yeah.
But instead they had value. Women
Yep.
had value, and so it made it more attractive. And I think that's a good
Yeah.
point. Yeah.
Yeah. That I'm smiling also because I had wrote down a note that she mentioned that she did an NPR interview, and she actually highlighted. I think they were talking about abortion. I don't know if that was the whole talk, but at this one point that I'm jumping in, she was talking. They were talking about pro-life and abortion arguments and such, and she actually apparently brought up the point that pro-life is actually more inclusive and more open-minded in the sense that you're welcoming all as human, not just a certain subset of people on this earth as human. You're welcoming all as human, and that it's holistic because you're appreciating the body and the mind. And
Yeah.
the arguments that we brought up at the beginning of this talk. And she said that her talk was canceled.
Yeah.
Like, so she was emphasizing, actually, I'm using your words, and I'm actually showing that God's approach to this is actually include. He wants, well, he wants all to be saved. But
Yeah.
I was almost going to say that. I was going to use that, but that's a little bit. Not, my point is, all are human. All have human.
Yeah.
All should have right to live.
Hmm.
And why are you leaving this upside down? They didn't like her using their language, so they
Yeah.
canceled her talk. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So again, excellent book. I think especially with really we see year after year things becoming more extreme, and she goes to some logical ends that we haven't seen yet, but I think that are on the horizon. And
Yeah.
so I think this is a great resource to look into.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, actually, I didn't want to skip this, and it goes actually with what you just said. Is that down the road, and she was hinting at it, and it actually is her last chapter. If you remember this point about a contract, the
Hmm.
social contract theory, where everything comes down to a legal document and what I agree to, and she talks about a
Yep.
contract, and basically it's like if you hold up your end of the deal and I hold up my end of the deal, then we're good. But if I at all have a hint that you might be not meeting your end of the deal, I can just jump out. I can jump ship. And her point is that, and she actually, if I remember correctly, I think she goes back to abortion, euthanasia, the hookup culture, like all the big topics that she hit, and she breaks down each one, how you're seeing this argument in each of them, where it's no longer the biological component of, like I was hinting at earlier, father, mother, and children. It's you know, I think she says the state, but legal, decision making, that now we have to lean on that versus the way we're created and made. And so it's kind of like, well, actually, probably another, example, divorce. Like, you could use that with divorce. Well, the second my marriage isn't working out, I can just toss aside because it's a legal contract. Or kids, the second they're, I'm losing my patience with them, or they cost too much money or whatever, I can just say, wash my hands of it. And you kind of can see that in everything. It's like your obligations go out the window when you're having the thought process of everything comes down to, am I in agreement with what I'm doing here, rather than I have a duty
Hmm.
to fulfill before the Lord, rather than I'm just, agreeing to something, and if the second I don't like it, I can get out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
uh, Felt a lot connections. I'm reading, actually doing a little reading group with some guys down here. We're going through Mere Christianity, and he deals a lot with this. He starts off with the natural law, that there's a component that exists that we all agree on, right? That all humankind, he gives all these illustrations and examples, but it's immaterial, right? It's like the law of gravity, and he gives that illustration how it's a little bit different. But the thing is, and one of the topics we talk about a lot going through this book is would this book suffice today? Right? Because they were originally talks on the
That's
lecture.
a great question.
Or would there need to be more now because we've been more removed from where they were when these talks went on? And I think we need to have these kinds of conversations. And I think, again, coming back to seeing how beautiful Christianity is, the gospel,
Mm-hmm.
what God has given and provided through, just his love for his creation. And I just saying that, I think of Jonah, right? Jonah sitting on the hillside, ready for God to zap Nineveh out of
Yeah.
existence.
Yeah.
And God says, like, I created them. And that's his basis for his love there. He says, I created them. And he says, all these souls, and then he says, plus much cattle, right? He's like, I love my creation. And I think that was something that I really enjoyed meditating on, going through this and seeing the beauty of of God and his creation, and making sure that I understand in his word, and I want to understand more as a result of the body and the creation in a biblical way.
Yeah.
And I think this is something I encourage whenever, because it feels like every other day we've got some sort of big social dilemma,
Mm-hmm.
and news goes so fast, right? It's like you not only need to receive this information, you need to react on it, right? You
Yeah.
need to have an opinion on it today, and instead slowing down and saying, well, what does God say about this? And really, it takes time and it takes study. But I think it's, especially as we see these things not going away, right? They're, if anything, increasing,
Yeah.
to make that a Bible study and to say, let's figure out what God says about it. If we believe that the Word of God is true and has all this wisdom for us, let's jump into that. But I think Nancy Piercy here has given a good launch off point, and
Yeah.
hits a lot of these really big issues.
Yeah, I think if there was one thing I wish she would have done, and maybe just because she didn't have enough pages, is I don't think that she went a lot into the past 2,000 years, like since Lord Jesus on the earth, like some of these thought processes and how they played out. She was so modern in how she's,
Yes.
maybe
Yep.
the last 60, 70 years, a lot of her examples and such. But the 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 point and the reason why I get that is I actually might have been something in her book, but something triggered where I was reading about the first and second centuries AD and how the approach of that day was abortion, actually, because if
Yes. Yeah.
in the first 8 days they could decide if they wanted the child or not, and it was actually up to the father, not up to the mother. It's up to the father, and at the eighth day they could decide to still kill the child or put the child out in nature and let the baby fend for itself. And the point of this book was this is not a new argument, and Christians stood up for it at that time against abortion and against infanticide and such. And because sometimes you hear that today, oh, well, it's a political thing and it's just a modern argument. Christians have seen for thousands of years that it's clearly in the scriptures and how the Lord made us and how the Lord wants us to appreciate life, that no, we should have those stances. So I'd love to see if she would go back maybe in the last 1,000 or 2,000 years and kind of how it's developed. But like I said, I think she,
Yeah.
that was not her space here. But it would be neat to see, because sometimes we hear that. We hear
Yeah.
like, well, you're kind of biased toward this century, these last few, whatever, 30 years, 40 years.
Right.
I
Right.
don't know about that, actually.
Yeah.
So,
Even like Mary Slessor in Africa, she was
oh
out
yeah,
collecting children that had been
great
left in
example.
the jungle,
Hmm.
and so not just,
Or Amy Carmichael.
yeah,
Yeah.
across time, but across the globe. It
Mhm.
was in all sorts of cultures, but
Yeah.
good. Hopefully we have uh, prepared the palate for many
Yeah.
listeners so that they can jump into this book.
Yeah. No, I'm
So
glad I could share it with everyone. excited to read it again when I can get to it. I have a few others on my plate, but it's a great book, and I think it'll be a blessing to a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you for the worthwhile suggestion.
Anytime.
Yeah.